I call the meeting of the Capital Investment to order today, January 16th. All right, members, super excited to be here. It looks like we do have a quorum, so that is great. And we're just going to move right along, members, to the overview on the Capital Investment Committee by House Fiscal and House Research staff. And if don't mind introducing yourselves. I know most of us know you already from years here, but for new members and maybe new public members tuning in, thank you.
Good morning, Chair Franson and members. For the record, my name is Chelsea Griffin, and I'm a legislative analyst with House Research. I am here this morning with my nonpartisan colleague, Mr. Andy Lee, and we've been asked to give an overview of capital investment and state bonding today. I do want to point out that House Research has a publication that shares the same title as this opening slide, Capital Investment and State Bonding. So you're welcome to peruse that for more information on the topics that you find interesting today. I actually worked on updates to that publication over the interim, and the updated version will be published in the next few weeks. So I'll be sure to send that out to the committee when it's been posted on our website. Before we dive into the substantive material that we're going to cover today, we do have a couple of slides about the role of us as nonpartisan staff. So Mr. Lee and I work for different departments. I work for House Research and he works for House Fiscal, but we share a lot of common features of our roles. So first, we serve all members and committees of the Minnesota House of Representatives. Secondly, our services are always confidential and neutral. So by confidential, we mean that we will never share any information that we discuss with you with anyone else without your explicit permission. And by neutral, we mean we share just information that can assist you in doing your job. We are educators for a large part of our roles. We're not political strategists. We are also both required to become subject matter experts in our topic areas that we're assigned. So I'm assigned capital investment and local government, and I study those areas during the entire year. And Mr. Lee covers capital investment and transportation. And then we both have work all year long. Our role in the work that we do changes depending on if there's legislative session occurring or not. But in the interim, we work on things like publications, we staff interim committees, we go on the bonding tours when they occur. So you will see us probably this fall on those tours. But we do have other work that we do during the interim. So even though we have some similarity in our roles, we do provide different services. In House Research, one of the services that I provide to members is bill drafting. So if there is, for example, a capital project in your district that you're interested in having drafted into bill form for introduction, you can certainly talk to me about that, and I'll work with you to get it in the proper form. I also conduct topical research. So if there's an issue that you're interested in doing a deep dive on, you can contact me and I'll write you a memo on the topic. I also can provide you with information if there's a specific question that comes up in your district. I'll give you information that pertains to that question and you can get back to the constituent. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lee to talk a bit about the role of fiscal analysts.
Madam Chair and members, my name is Andrew Lee from House Fiscal staff, and for the Capital Investment Committee, most of my role for this committee is assembling the spreadsheet of an omnibus capital investment bill. In other committees, my role will be in working with agencies, Department of Revenue, in terms of assembling spreadsheets and presenting fiscal notes, which the agencies prepare. Typically, the Capital Investment Committee doesn't hear too many bills with fiscal notes, but it has happened on occasion. And so if there's a bill here that has policy implications and also fiscal implications, then I'd be the one to talk to request a fiscal note. Yeah, but most of my work on the Capital Investment Committee is usually in making the spreadsheet. So.
Okay, so we're going to dive into the substance of the presentation now. Let's talk about bonds generally. The bonding process at a very, very high level has three steps. So the government entity issues the bonds. The investors purchase the bonds and they receive payments with interest. And then the proceeds from the bond sale fund capital projects. So 3 steps and then 3 primary participants. You have the government entity that's issuing the bonds, the investors buying the bonds, and then you have the financial professionals that are working between the government entity that's issuing and the investors to get the bonds in the hands of the investors. There are a variety of ways that you can categorize bonds. This slide contains a list of the common ways that the bonds are categorized. So issuer, purpose, source of payment, tax status, and term. I will note that in previous bonding bills, the articles have typically been organized by the type of bond. So we'll have Article 1 be the general obligation bond projects. There can be an appropriation bond article, and occasionally if trunk highway bonds, for example, are brought into a bonding bill, then trunk highways will get their own bonding article, but it's really up to the author of the bill how they want the bill organized. There are 3 primary sources of authority for state bonding in the state of Minnesota. The first is the state constitution, specifically Article 11, covers information about GO bonds. There's nothing in the Constitution regarding other kinds of bonding. So there's nothing in there about revenue bonds, appropriation bonds, et cetera. Then we have the Minnesota statutes, which provide additional information and requirements for GO bonding. Specifically, there's Chapter 16A. That's where the bulk of the statutory provisions are that relate to state GO bonds. I'll also note that Chapter 475 covers the authority for municipal bonding or local government bonding. And then we have federal law interactions as well. So the federal laws relate to tax and whether the bonds that are issued by the state are tax exempt or taxable. You'll hear the term full faith, credit, and taxing powers in relation to state GO bonds. This phrase is used in the Constitution in Article 11, Section 4. I have it highlighted here on the slide. And so the language says, the state may contract public debts for which its full faith, credit, and taxing powers may be pledged. What that means in plain language is that the state is putting its full financial weight behind these bonds. And interestingly, in Article 11, Section 7, there's a provision that authorizes the state auditor to levy a property tax on all taxable property in the state to ensure that the principal and interest on the GO bonds that's due within the year would be paid. Now, to date, this has not been used, but if the state was ever in a very terrible financial state, that authority does exist in the Constitution. There are 4 primary requirements for the use of state GO bond proceeds. They're listed on this slide. I'm going to go into them in a bit of detail. So the first requirement is that state GO bond proceeds be used for a public purpose. Generally, a public purpose is considered an expenditure that's reasonably expected to achieve a legitimate public goal or benefit. The legislature is given great deference in determining what is public, or what's a public purpose, excuse me. Then the second requirement is that the use or the purpose for the bond proceeds is authorized in the state constitution. So if you look at Article 11, Section 5 of the state constitution, there's a whole list of the purposes for which the bond proceeds may be used. If it's not listed in the Constitution, the bond proceeds cannot be used. And then the third requirement is that the use be specified in law. So the way that this is accomplished is by describing the project for which the bond proceeds will finance in great detail. So when you look at a bonding bill, you'll see descriptive language such as pre-design, design, construct. We're trying to identify the specific phases of the project that are going to be covered by the bond proceeds. We identify the grantee, the location of the project, and the public purpose. So if you're working with me on a bonding bill, I will ask you a lot of questions to make sure that that information is captured. And then finally, the use of, the bond proceeds or the bonds must mature in no more than 20 years. This is a constitutional requirement. The custom of the legislature has been to originate bonding bills in the House. And this is because of a provision in Article 4, Section 18 of the Constitution that requires revenue bills to originate in the House. So tax bills originate in the House. Bonding bills that can be argued to be raising revenue, and so out of an abundance of caution, the House has originated the bonding bills in the past. The most common purpose for which state GO bond proceeds are issued is for bonds to acquire and better public land and buildings. We're talking about capital projects here. This is the first purpose that's stated in the list of purposes in the Constitution. I have it highlighted here on the slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a capital project is. So a capital project is it's a project that's a fixed asset. We're talking about land and buildings or another fixed asset. It can't be equipment that's movable, and it can't be an intangible. The fixed asset has to be long-lived, and Bond Counsel has suggested that long-lived is at least 10 years. And the public improvements have to be substantial. We're talking about major projects. We're not talking about routine maintenance. A capital project has to be publicly owned, so it needs to be owned by the state or a political subdivision thereof. And a political consideration for you is that capital projects that are financed with state GO bonds have to have a supermajority vote. It's a vote of 3/5 of the members of each house of the legislature. In the House, that's 81 votes. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the other GO bond purposes that are listed in the Constitution. This slide covers 3 that you may encounter during your time here at the legislature. So there's trunk highways. Trunk highways are listed, or highway improvements are listed in Article 11, Section 5, but then there's also Article 14 of the Constitution that provides additional requirements and guidance. Forestation is another use of GO bond proceeds, so we can bond for trees. And railroads can also be bonded for. One interesting fact about these other purposes is that they don't require a supermajority vote. So a bill that only needs a majority of members to pass, these other purposes can be inserted into that bill, and the bill doesn't need a supermajority vote. It's only those capital projects that need the supermajority. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bond Counsel and who they are. So Bond Counsel are specialized public finance lawyers, and they issue opinions on the legality to sell the bonds. The Attorney General retains Bond Counsel for the state, and that Bond Counsel right now is Kutak Rock, and they provide opinions on the bonds. Then just a few other topics on state bonding. So the use of state bond financed property. There are restrictions that attach to state bond financed property. And this applies even if only a small portion of the project was financed with state GO bonds. There's a declaration that's recorded on the property when the project receives financing from state GO bonds. The restrictions do disappear after a time period that's equal to 125% of the useful life, or until the property is sold as provided in law. And sales of state bond finance property do have some requirements that they need to go through. Minnesota Management and Budget is involved in those sales. So if you have more questions about that, we can talk about it offline, but M&B is really the experts on those sales. Reimbursement. State GO bond proceeds cannot be used to reimburse for work that's already been paid for. So this sometimes comes up in a situation where a local government has started a capital project, and they would like to be reimbursed for the parts of the project that they've already started. We can't use the GO bond proceeds for that, and that's related to the federal tax law provisions that are related to the state GO bonds. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the non-state match requirement and the full funding requirement. So Section 16A.502 has a requirement that the project as described be fully funded. And that means that the state GO bond proceeds that are appropriated for the project, in addition to any local government funds or federal funds that are going to pay for the project, that they cover that phase or the multiple phases of the project as described in the bill. But the appropriation is not available until that full funding happens. In this non-state match, you'll hear about that as well. In Section 16A.86, there's a provision that has an expectation that the state share of the financing for the capital project is no more than half of the cost of the project. That same provision goes on to say that there's nothing that prevents the legislature from funding more than half of the project. The governor can also recommend that more than half of a project be funded with state GO bond proceeds, but there is this initial expectation that the locals are coming up with half of the funding. Okay, this is the final slide that I have before I turn it over to Mr. Lee. This is a chart that covers just a few topics or issues that are different between state general obligation bonding and local general obligation bonding. So state general obligation bonding does not have a referendum requirement. The ability to issue state GO bonds doesn't need to go to the voters of the state of Minnesota. We do this as a legislative process. That's not necessarily the case with local GO bonds. Often they have to have a referendum in order to have a project approved. There's no limit on net debt for state GO bonding. There are guidelines, and I believe that Mr. Lee is going to touch on that a little bit, but there's not a set limit in the Constitution or in statute for our debt. It can be net debt limits, though, for local GO bonding. I would direct you to Section 475.53 on those net debt limits. There's a public ownership requirement for state GO bonding, but that doesn't necessarily apply for local GO bonding. For example, Section 475.525, this is municipal district heating bonds that allows locals to use bond proceeds for loans to private corporations for a district heating system. That's not something that we could do with state GO bonds. And then finally, the purposes for which state GO bonds can be used are listed in the Constitution. The Constitution does not cover local GO bonding. That's covered in statute, primarily under Chapter 475. And with that, Chair Franzen, members, I conclude my portion of the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have at this time, or Chair Franzen, if you'd like to save questions to the end, it's certainly up to you.
Thank you, Chelsea. No, we can take member questions right now before we move on to Mr. Lee's presentation. Representative Scraba.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm so used to calling you Chelsea. I don't know if I could just, whatever, Chelsea. You mentioned one half of the funding. I know last year there was a bill trying to make it statutorily that it was half. Do you know if that bill passed? I mean, in the madness that happened that night, I don't know what passed and what didn't. I don't know if that was included in the bill. I know the bonding bill didn't pass, but.
Chair Franzen, Representative Scraba, no, I don't think that anything along those lines passed
right.
Last session. I somewhat recall a bill along the lines that you were talking about. I need to go back and look at the bills to remember the exact language of the bill, too.
Okay. Madam Chair, also.
Representative Scraba.
Could you repeat what you had said about half the match and the you had said a statute or something, 16A502, and then the other one.
Sure. Chair Franzen, Representative Scraba, I can go back over that information if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So what I was talking about was these two different statutes. You have 16A.502, and that is the full funding requirement, which requires the project to be fully funded with a combination of state GO bond proceeds, local government funds, federal funds, whatever other non-state sources are going to be applied to the project. So full funding is required before the appropriation is made available. And then there's this other requirement for funding, which has the expectation of for a local project of the local government coming up with at least half of the financing for the project. And like I mentioned, there's nothing that prevents the legislature from going above 50%, but the initial expectation is that a local unit of government is coming up with 50% of the funds.
Representative Scrabo.
Madam Chair, it's expected, but it's not. I mean, if we put it in the bill that says no local match required, then that's out, right? Then the bill that passes, if it says no local match required, then whatever comes from bonding pays for it.
Chelsea?
Chair Franzen and Representative Scraba, sure, the legislature could choose to do that.
And final question.
Representative Scrabo.
Thank you. So, and this happens more than not. A project comes up and they need funding for design, but not for the project. So when we fund the design, but not the project, they can still use that money because the design is separate from the project. Is that how you see it also? Following me?
Chair Franzen and Representative Scraba, if the state is appropriating state GO bond proceeds for design, that is the project as described. And like I mentioned, those state bond financing restrictions would continue to apply to the project, even if the other portions of the project, such as construction, furnishing, equipping, if those are being paid for with other sources, those restrictions do still apply because a part of the project has been funded with state GO bonds.
Sorry, Madam Chair.
Representative Scrabo.
Madam Chair. So if the project, let's say the design comes in and there's no way we can get the money for the project, and then it sits on the shelf, what's the process for that then? Or is it just dead then? You know, you got your money for a design. We don't have $200 million to build this building. No one wants to give any money. The economy goes bad. Is that still everything legit? Is everything still good? Following me? You know, my concern is that the project's not going to get done, but we paid for a design.
Chelsea?
Chair Franzen and Representative Scraba. So the project, for purposes of the appropriation, would be design. If the design portion is fully funded, the design would move forward, the appropriation would be available, design would be completed. With the remainder of the project, it would stall.
Yeah.
The state wouldn't, in your hypothetical situation, the state hasn't appropriated any additional funds, but there's no other project that we've defined for purposes of the larger project that you're talking about. I think often in that case, you'll see the public owner of that project come back to the legislature and ask for additional funding. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the fate of that project would be unknown.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Representative Scraba. And it also behooves us lawmakers to be realistic when projects come before us and our local units of government or different interest groups come before us, and just give them the lay of the land of the reality of bonding here at the Minnesota Capitol. Before we move on to Andrew's presentation here, I'd like to introduce, we have two pages in the room if they want to stand up. We have Michael Thank you, Michael. And we also have Earl, so take a look. If you guys are in need of something from the page, please wave them down and they will be able to assist you. And then we also have our GOP researcher. We have Justin Brill. Justin, if you want to, wonderful. And that, you know who he is now. And then we'll move on now to Andrew's presentation. And we all love numbers. Math is my favorite subject. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. So in your packets, you should have a stapled spreadsheet that looks like this. It is titled 2023 Capital Budget Laws 2023, Chapters 71 and 72. This will give members a sense of what capital investment spreadsheets look like. Usually there's multiple versions of this and often multiple columns of different proposals. I won't go through every single line, but to give you a sense of the major state agencies that receive bonding appropriations, I'll just go through the agency level. So the first one is University of Minnesota that you can see for their two projects, they received $135 million in Chapter 72, and you'll note that under the fund type, it says GO, that refers to general obligation bonding. That's the most common funding type that you'll see in these spreadsheets. So if there's another funding type, usually it's highlighted to kind of make it stand out. Then under Minnesota State, you'll notice that all of the projects that aren't higher education asset preservation, except one, are GOUF. That refers to user financing. And in that case, the Minnesota State system comes up with a third of the cost of financing the capital project. So the dollar amount that you see, say on line 12, $23,999,000, that's the total project cost. But of that, the state general fund debt service is only paying for 2/3 of that, and 1/3 is coming from other sources like tuition or other system revenues. Then moving on to the next page, you can see a few K-12 state agencies, the Department of Education, and a grant program called the Library Construction Grants on line 50. This is a grant program that local units of government can apply for and receive funds. There's a number of these, and I'll point out the big ones. Then the Minnesota State Academies, the Purpose Center for the Arts, and then one of the larger agencies in these bonding lists is the Department of Natural Resources. So you can see a few lines relating to the Department of Natural Resources assets, asset preservation, betterment of buildings, forest nursery, and so on. Then you can see a couple of rows relating to the flood hazard mitigation program. That is grants to local units of government for flood readiness, and they typically include things like water impoundment, levees, so those sorts of things. Then you can see a number of other grant programs. And then turning to page 3, you can see the state trails. These are trails called out in state statute that are then this funds either the maintenance or expansion of them. And then starting on line 143, you can see this, and you can see this in a number of different agencies, grants to political subdivisions. So this is the grants to cities, counties, townships, school districts, sometimes joint powers boards for various capital projects. So then moving on to the next page, the Pollution Control Agency. Most of the grants in this that are made through this agency relate to either contamination mitigation or solid waste projects. Then under the Board of Water and Soil Resources, there are a conservation program called CREP and a program for local road wetland replacement. And then you can see 2 grants to political subdivisions under Board of Water and Soil Resources, sometimes abbreviated to Bowser. Then you can see Department of Agriculture, the Minnesota Zoo, Then on the next page, the Department of Administration. This is the appropriation, or the appropriations to this agency tend to include buildings around the Capitol complex. So you can see on line 236, $4.5 million for the demolition of the old Ford building that's on was on University Avenue. The Amateur Sports Commission, Department of Military Affairs. Appropriations to this are for readiness centers or armories, but you can also see one for the Minnesota Military Museum at Camp Ripley. And then under the Department of Public Safety, grants for this are typically around the BCA or other functions in the Department of Public Safety. And then you can see various grants to political subdivisions for fire halls, police stations, and other public safety functions. Then under the Department of Transportation, two of the larger grant programs you can see on line 312 and 315. This is grants to political subdivisions through a program for local roads and local bridges. And you can see a lot of named grants to political subdivisions starting on line 330 that goes down to the next page. Then on page 8, you can see appropriations to the Metropolitan Council. I'll mention the Inflow and Infiltration Grant Program. This relates to groundwater seeping into wastewater pipes, Metro Parks, bus rapid transit, and then grants to political subdivisions. And typically the grants to political subdivisions under the Metropolitan Council relate to parks. Then under the Department of Human Services, you can see state-owned asset preservation, and then programs for early childhood learning and child protection facilities, and then grants relating to human services functions. Then the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Corrections, and then moving on to page 10, this tends to be one of the larger agency appropriation areas. The Department of Employment and Economic Development. Usually if a local government project doesn't have a home in another agency, it's found here. So economic development projects, community centers, things like that are here. And you can see those projects starting on line 498 and going all the way down through the next page. And on the next page, there's a number of grants to nonprofits. And continuing to page 12, and then continuing to page, the next agency starts on the top of page 13.
Mr. Lee, would you explain to us how grants to nonprofits are made?
Madam Chair and members, similar to grants to political subdivisions, the nonprofit has to be named what the state dollars are being used for, but unique to nonprofits, if there isn't a local sponsor, the appropriation would have to be made by the general fund. So not geo-bonding if the public facility isn't owning whatever the capital asset that's being paid for is. So.
And so, Mr. Lee, they would that nonprofit would need a fiscal agent, and that fiscal agent would have to be a local unit of government?
Madam Chair and members, if the nonprofit wanted to run a building that was financed with GO bonds, they would. If it's a general fund appropriation, it can be to the just to the nonprofit. But an example of where a nonprofit partners with a local government would be the big arts facilities in downtown Minneapolis or downtown St. Paul, or the Children's Museum, where the city is the owner of the facility, and so the city received the GO bond funds to build the facility, but it contracts with the nonprofit to do the operations of the facility. But if the nonprofit were ever to back out of that agreement, the city would be responsible for providing whatever was supposed to take place in that facility. So if it is general fund, it can be a grant to nonprofit, but if it's GO bonds, it has to be to a government entity.
Mr. Lee, would you also give the body, the next time we meet, just a list of maybe the last 10 years that we have used general fund for nonprofits and a list of those projects and dollar amounts? Thank you. Representative Scraba.
Madam Chair, thank you. In more simpler parlance, general fund is cash. And when we use cash, it can be a myriad of things we spend cash on. And just to remind everyone in the room, there's no cash this year. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Scraba. That is correct. We are broke. Continue on, Mr. Lee.
Madam Chair and members, and I can get you the list of nonprofits, but I also should note that I've been working on the interim of a publication of bonding and other capital investment appropriation history going back to 1963. And I thought printing that off would be a little bit much for this first committee, but for a history. So starting again on page 13, you can see the Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation Board. This was a GEO bond appropriation for Giants Ridge Water and Electrical, and then another big state agency that gets a lot of both programmatic grants and named grants to political subdivisions, the Public Facilities Authority. So you can see on line 692, the state match for federal grants for state revolving loan fund programs. This is a federal program that this GEO bonding amount receives matching funds to get federal dollars for wastewater treatment plants. And then there's a state program for both drinking water grants and clean water grants. And clean water is the euphemism for wastewater. And then Point Source Implementation Grant Program. This is was started in, I believe, 2017, and it is for very large wastewater projects. And then you can see general fund appropriation for Lewis and Clark Regional Water, and then a number of grants to political subdivisions for water projects. And you can see that continues on to the next page. Then moving on to the Housing Finance Authority, there's appropriations that it was in the 23 bills for both general fund and GO for public housing rehabilitation, and these are grants to local housing authorities. And then the Greater Minnesota Housing Program infrastructure and a grant to political subdivision for Minneapolis. That's the last one there. Then the Historical Society. And then this on the next page, you'll see totals, and you'll also see sort of a tax-related provision in the Department of Revenue. Often in bonding bills, other subject areas can come into the bill, as has happened in a number of cases. I think the most notable being in 2018, where the entire LCCMAR appropriations bill was also in the capital investment bill. So as you can see totals here, and I'll just make two quick notes on line 812 is the bond sale expenses. So a fraction of the total GEO bonding that the legislature has authorized has to be used to sell the bonds. And then also note on line 850 is the GEO cancellation. So that's where the legislature has appropriated money for projects, but for whatever reason they aren't moving forward. And in this case, the legislature canceled about $17 million worth of previously authorized projects that either came in under budget or weren't moving forward. And so on net, the GEO impact was right around $1.5 billion. And then moving on to debt service. So in your packets, you should have a one-page sheet that looks like this.
Mr. Lee, we have a question here from Representative Koznick. Okay, sounds good.
Madam Chair, so it's titled MN House Fiscal Analysis, Capital Investment Budget Areas. So if this was the list of the projects that the state is buying. This is the bill to pay the debt service for previously authorized projects. On line 5 of this spreadsheet, this is the debt service appropriation for about 20 years worth of GO borrowing. So you can see in fiscal 2024, it's around $500 million. And you can see by the biennium, it's around $1 billion to $1.2 billion to $1.4 billion every 2 years. And that's the debt service to pay for previously authorized GO bonding. I should note that there's an assumption that MMB makes when they forecast these numbers for both what the interest rates will be, but also how much debt they assume the legislature will authorize. So the MMB is assuming that the legislature in this session will authorize a $790 million GO bill and a $1.1 billion GO bill in the 2026 session. So if the legislature doesn't do that or does a lesser amount, then there would be savings on this line. Then moving on to other capital appropriations, so you can see 2 items related to appropriation bonds for the University of Minnesota, the biomed facilities, and the stadium. And then I'll briefly go through these kind of miscellaneous appropriation bonds. The first one on line 13 is the state appropriation refunding bonds, which doesn't really give you much description of what it was. But it goes back to 2011, where the state had about a $5 billion budget deficit. And about $3.5 billion of that was accounted for by school aid shifts. And then about $1 billion of that was accounted for by reductions. And then the state took out a loan backed by tobacco settlement revenue from the 1990s tobacco settlement, and basically securitized that revenue stream. Then they later resold that as a general fund appropriation bond. So it was essentially taking out a loan for a one-time budget hole. And so that is the state is still paying for that. Then the next 2 lines are related to the 2012 Viking Stadium legislation. And some of this is sales tax collected by Minneapolis that goes to pay the city's share of the debt service. And some of that is a separate payment to Minneapolis and St. Paul related to sports facilities. You can see that on line 14 and 15. There used to be another line here that was the state's share of the debt service, but the state's share was paid off in the last biennium. Then on line 16, you can see the Lewis and Clark Water Project. That was an appropriation bond that occurred a few times starting in 2015. Duluth Regional Exchange District relating to parking ramps around the medical district in Duluth. Electric vehicle infrastructure, a smaller appropriation bond that was authorized in, I want to say 2020. MPCA response to release related to contaminated lands, public TV, and then one-time appropriation. So this was essentially the general fund amount from previous bonding and general fund appropriations. So you can see that about $1 billion there on line 21. And then in the past, the Capital Investment Committee target has also included MHFA supportive housing appropriation bonds, and so that is noted on line 26. The jurisdiction has changed, and so I just wanted to note that. And then on the back of this spreadsheet, you can see the total principal outstanding debt. So if that last page was what we're paying every year, this is how much is left of the various types of bonds. So you can see the GO various purpose bonds of $4.4 billion, which accounts for a little over half of the state's debt portfolio. Then trunk highway bonds, which is just under 30%. And then the various appropriation bonds, of which MHFA is one of the largest, and then real estate appropriation bonds, or also certificates of participation, where the state is contracting with a third party to have new buildings. The largest being the State Office Building on line 49, the Senate Office Building on line 50, and then the Agriculture, Health, and DHS buildings. Those were buildings that were built with the St. Paul Port Authority, where the state is essentially in a lease-to-own arrangement with the St. Paul Port Authority, and I think these are the last year of payments for those two buildings. Pause for any questions before I move to debt capacity.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lee. On the GO trunk highway bonds, could you explain to the members and public how that can go against our bonding dollars that are available? And then following up on that, the state office building, the renovation and the addition. Could you explain why the interest is a lot higher on that project compared to our other bonded projects? Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, so starting with the trunk highway bonds, these are typically authorized in transportation bills, although in the past they sometimes are authorized in bonding bills too. When the state evaluates all of its debt, and that includes GO appropriation bonds and other real estate debts, those count towards the total amount that the state can either be in debt for or have to figure out in terms of a window of pay down schedule. So I'll get into the debt capacity a little bit and kind of explain how both the trunk highway bonds and the GO various purpose bonds are in competition with each other in terms of how much the state can authorize. But the way that they're in competition specifically is in Guideline 1 and Guideline 3. Guideline 1 is how much principal can be outstanding. Guideline 3 is sets a requirement of how the state structure the debt, that it be paid off quickly. What's sort of unique about trunk highway bond authorizations is that in the past the legislature has authorized them for future years. So there's a few trunk highway bond authorizations that the state will start being able to draw on to do trunk highway construction. And because they were pushed into the future, that means that there's a little bit more of a restriction on Guideline 3. And I'll get into that with the state debt management guidelines. Then moving on to the state office building. So this was a authorization for what's called a certificate of participation, where the embedded in the House's appropriation for operating is a payment to the Department of Administration, and administration pays pays MMB to pay the debt service for a debt product called certificates of participation. That it functions like an appropriation bond, except rather than direct appropriation to pay the debt, it's through the legislative appropriation. This $440 million doesn't include the interest payments, and I can get you a schedule of the interest payments. In theory, GO bonds would have the lowest interest cost because they have the full faith and credit pledge that no matter what, the state auditor would make payments if the legislature were ever to not appropriate debt service. Since appropriation bonds and certificates of participation included don't have that full faith and credit pledge, the bond market might see that as not as safe of investment, so there could be a higher interest rate as a result. What the differential is dependent on market conditions at the time. And so I can follow up on getting you some numbers for the interest and what potential differential would be. So I hope that answered your question, Madam Chair.
I have a follow-up. Just going to get used to the Senate office building here. I have a follow-up on that. So what if the state were to default on the state office building? Who's responsible? Who's liable for that?
Madam Chair and members, in the bond sale authorization for the certificates of participation, there is a clause about non-appropriation, basically saying it is not GO debt. I think in practice, were the state ever to default on any appropriation bond, there would be probably pretty immediate ramifications for the state's credit rating and also potentially local units of government's credit rating for because they can be supported by the state. I can get more information on that. So. Then moving on to the debt capacity report. This is in your packet. It's a document from the Department of Management and Budget. This lays out the debt management guidelines that you can see on page 3. The first requires that the total principal outstanding can't exceed 3.25% of state personal income, which is sort of a macroeconomic number as the denominator. And then the second requires that both the authorized and unissued, so the debt that the legislature has already said the MMB can go forth and sell, and the principal outstanding can't exceed 6%. Kind of the idea behind the second guideline is to restrict the legislature from authorizing a lot of bonds into the future. And then the third guideline, which I mentioned earlier, requires that 40% of general obligation debt, and that this includes both GO and trunk highway, has to be paid off within 5 years, and 70% has to be paid off within 10 years. The idea behind this is that the state doesn't enter into bonds that essentially push the payments off into the future, that there's a rapid repayment schedule so that the state pays less interest on state debt. And then on page 4, you can see the calculation for guideline 1 and guideline 2. And then the maximum capacity is on page 5 for guidelines 1 and 2. So you can see in 2025, the maximum capacity would be $3.4 billion. However, you'll notice in the line above that MMB assumes $790 million, and that's because if you turn to page 6, where MMB estimates the capacity for debt guideline number 3, the most the state could do in this year and stay in compliance with that third debt management guideline of payoff of GO bonds would be $790. And I should note this is a little bit more a lower limit on guideline 3 than existed in the past. And it's sort of a few unique factors, mostly around trunk highway bond authorizations being pushed off into later years. So on page 7, you can see the math of all of the authorized and unissued and principal outstanding state debt. And then on the next page, you can see a table showing the history of guidelines 1 and 2. And on the last page, a comparison of debt to personal income by state and debt service to revenues. And I should note that the debt management guidelines are not constitutional or statutory. They are a policy of the Department of Management and Budget, and the department can change them. These guidelines came into effect in 2009 after the last debt management guidelines were about to be exceeded, mostly because of the Great Recession and state revenues declining drastically. The old debt management guideline restricted the amount of state debt based off of debt service payments to state revenues, and essentially the state had been authorizing GO bonds such that they were maintaining compliance, but what happened in the Great Recession is state revenues declined pretty drastically, and so the state was out of compliance without issuing any new debt. So MMB, in consultation with bond houses and rating agencies, came up with these first two guidelines. I think the third guideline had existed previously. But like I say, these are policies of MMB. The legislature could potentially ignore them and exceed them, although there would be the potential for credit impacts if that were to happen. And I think that's all I have on the debt management guidelines. Pause for any questions if anyone has.
Thank you. Representative Kosnick.
Thank you, Chair Franzen. Mr. Lee, for the purpose of the committee and myself, could you talk a little bit about on one of your handouts on line 18 was the EV infrastructure in 2020. Where was that infrastructure placed, and just give us some background on that. And then the other one, just to talk about the local road wetland replacement program and how that works with transportation. And I know it's transportation questions, but it is on the spreadsheets here. So if you could just give us a little bit of background on that, please.
Mr. Lee?
Yes, Madam Chair and Representative Koznick, on the electric vehicle infrastructure, I will have to get back to you on that one of where it was. I'm trying to recall if that was only state facilities or if it was a grant program for non-state facilities. My memory doesn't quite serve going back to that one, but I'll follow up with the committee.
Madam Chair, I appreciate that. And that's kind of what I wanted to know, if it was here on the Capitol complex or out in the public. So yeah. Thank you.
And then on on the trunk highway.
Madam Chair, the local road wetland replacement program, how that kind of works and the bonding aspect of it.
Yeah. Madam Chair and members, and again, I'll follow up from my understanding of that program. The idea is that when a local road jurisdiction, a city or a county, expands their roads in wetland areas, there's a program in another statute, kind of a non-bonding statute, that requires replacement value of that lost wetland. And that, I think it was, I want to say going back to the 90s, there was an expectation that the legislature would appropriate money to local units of government in basically a banking system where, if say St. Louis County is in a certain land bank area and it builds a new road and it needs to find more wetland to put in a conservation easement. The idea was that the state geobonding dollars would be used to meet that local need to find a wetland easement. And that it's kind of a more complicated program, but it's essentially in different districts, local road authorities are required when they build a new road in a wetland area to find a bank for it, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. And we have Representative Scrabo next.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I got a couple of questions on this sheet. The University of Minnesota Biomed and Stadium, are those recurring? Are they going to keep going on for a long, long time, or is this the end?
Mr. Lee?
Madam Chair and Representative Scraba, the stadium was, I believe, 2005, and the biomedical appropriation bonds were 2008, but I think there was some flexibility that they could continue selling them into, I want to say 2010, 2011. I will have to double check. I think one of these might be a 30-year bond, and the other is a 20-year bond. Both of these were refinanced, and the University of Minnesota used some of the savings for other facilities. But I will get back to you on the end dates, but I think some of them would be coming up in the next 6 or 7 years.
Representative Scraba.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Lee. Okay, so these are all just 20 years, and we're just looking at a snapshot of it. I was trying to figure out how long the tails were on these, but they're pretty long. All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Representative Scraba. Does anybody else have any more questions? Okay, does that conclude your presentation? Oh, Representative Koznick has a question.
Thank you. I just looked at that. I didn't really give you the wave.
Okay.
Madam Chair, Mr. Lee, just to kind of clarify, and I think you were quite clear, but the debt guidelines, and I asked because it's been talked about a little bit in the Transportation Committee and some of the, in the Senate especially, but the debt guidelines are just a set guideline by MMB. There's not state statute that prohibits it, but there are some consequences that we need to be aware of. How do we find out what the credit impacts, to use the words that you mentioned, might be if the legislature did exceed that for the transportation, trunk highway bonds?
Mr. Griffin? Or I'm sorry, Mr. Lee.
Madam Chair, Representative Kosnick, I'll have to follow up with you on that. It is a bit of a hypothetical of what would a credit rating impact, what would, if we were to exceed it, would the credit rating agencies immediately downgrade us? It's hard to say. I can say I know of an example where the state of Connecticut about 10 years ago was having pretty bad fiscal situation. They got a credit rating downgrading from the major rating agencies, but because the market was very, very hungry for public debt, they had a more favorable interest rate in their sale after a downgrading than before. That's probably a pretty unique situation, but I guess to say that there's market factors as well as fiscal management factors in terms of credit rating. So.
All right. And then I think, Ms. Griffin, did you have something to add?
Chair Franzen and members, I just want to call your attention to this final slide of our presentation. It has some resources listed on it. So Minnesota Management and Budget, we have the link here to the capital budget page, to the debt management page. And then I make mention here of the capital grants manual. So after a bonding bill is enacted, that has capital projects that are funded in it. This is a wonderful resource to share with with the locals that may have received a named appropriation. It has a lot of information about how the grants are administered, their checklists. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. I can send the link. I know I don't have one here on the slide, but I can send it around to the committee. And then just a reminder to check out the state constitution, Article 11, and then Chapter 16A if you're looking for the authority around state general obligation bonding.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Griffin. And members and to the public as well, all of the documents that have been handed out to you today can also be found on the Capital Investment Committee website. So that will be found under the Minnesota House of Representatives. Now, members, seeing how we had a nonpartisan give us an overview of bonding, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We're going to go around the members, starting with Representative Skraba, and introduce yourself and give us a little blurb about why bonding is important to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Franzen. I'm Roger Skraba from Ely, Minnesota, District 3A. I sat on capital investments last 2 years. Traveled the state 2 years ago to see with Chair Franzen and Chelsea and Mr. Lee. We saw it's enlightening. And I really encourage you to go, if you can, to see the state assets and what we need to do in this position, what our role is. And I find I really wanted to be on it again, and I'm glad I got to be on capital investments again. There's a lot going on in our state, and this is one of the key. The trunk highway is new to me. I'm on transportation also. So it's going to be interesting watching how the two blend, because it's just my third year. I'm starting to see like, wow, this is big. And then Mr. Lee's just kind of the whole billions of dollars that we're looking at and the credit rating, how important all of that is. So I'm looking forward to this year, learning more. Mind is open all the time. There's something new could happen, and that's shift, fire, and adjust. We just move around and keep doing it. So, but it fits my district very well also, just so you know. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative Skraba. Representative Sexton.
Good morning, ma'am, and the rest of the group. My name is Tom Sexton. I represent District 19B, which is really Medford, Owatonna, and Waseca. I live in Waseca. And capital investment absolutely is essential, as Representative Skraba said, to outlying Minnesota. Small towns, a lot of heart, but the tax base isn't there to support those. But yet we owe them clean water and a lot of other things to make sure that they can live the lifestyle that we really have here in Minnesota for the entire rest of the state. So that's my interest, and I really look forward to seeing the rest of the state on these visits.
Thank you, Representative Sexton. Representative Reimer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Max Reimer out of 28B, Chisago County. And what I would just say is, from a capital investment standpoint, it's important to me because it's important to the people I serve. Since I've been elected, I can say pretty safely that capital investment projects and trying to get a meeting with me has mainly revolved around these issues. We have a lot of different projects in Chisago County. I can specifically think of a few in Wyoming that the mayor has contacted me about. So it matters to my people and the people that I serve, and so therefore it matters to me. And I look forward to learning more and getting more educated on different things that are happening around the state.
Thank you, Representative Reimer. Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is John Koznick, State Representative, live in Lakeville, represent about half of Lakeville, Credit River, Elko, Newmarket, and the townships of Eureka and Newmarket. I will be chairing the Transportation Committee, so therefore most of my questions will be directed at that. But as I've served in the legislature, starting my 6th term, I recognize that a bonding bill is not necessarily a science of putting the right mixture together. There's an art to it, and having to get the 60% of the body. So it'll be interesting to work on the committee. I'm confident in the staff that we have. Thank you for your presentations. I know we have a lot of questions, and I'm first term on the committee and looking forward to learning more about it and with your help and your leadership, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Koznick. Representative Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Keith Allen. I represent 19A, which is just south of the Twin Cities. It encompasses the communities of Wanamingo, Canyon, Near Strand, Faribault, Morristown, and Janesville. And in previous work that I've done, rural infrastructure is something that's absolutely critical, especially around the wastewater treatment plants and whatnot. I'm seeing in several communities throughout southern Minnesota where the development of businesses, the development of getting housing and everything is coming into our community is really hamstrung by the capacity of our wastewater treatment plants, and whether or not we're going to be able to expand for a growing community that is trying to get its feet underneath it and modernize. So that's some of my biggest priorities, is focusing on the wastewater treatment plants and trying to find out how we're going to be able to fund them so we can help bring these towns up to compliance and also give them the opportunity to be able to grow. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Representative Allen. And I should have mentioned right away, Representative Myers is also on this committee. However, he had to step out to do a constituent meeting, and he can introduce himself next week. Next, we will have Vice Chair Fogelman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Marge Fogelman. I represent District 21B. I have all of one county and parts of 4 other ones. Jackson County, I represent the whole county, parts of Martin and Cottonwood, half of Watonwan, and about 2/3 of Nobles County. I am starting my 2nd term and also my 2nd term with Capital Investments. I am honored and excited to be the vice chair. I am excited to learn more about bonding because 2 years you learn some, but there's a lot to learn. I also think that we need to look at wants versus needs and make some hard decisions. That's not always easy for the people in our districts or the people in our state, but I also want to do what's right according to our Constitution. Thank you.
All right. And then to my right is the CLA. This is Ms. Nelson. Welcome to the team. And to my left is Representative, not yet, is my CA, Committee Administrator, Joe Marble. So super excited to have him part of the bonding committee as well. Members, State Representative Mary Franson, hailing from District 12B, which is the heart of the biggest city there is Alexandria. You may know Alexandria is the city that is easy to get to but hard to leave. Members, we bond because it is our responsibility to take care of public property, water projects, local roads and bridges, as well as the state-owned properties. Taxpayers of Minnesota expect their assets to be taken care of. They expect clean water. They expect safe roads and bridges. And in the past 4 years, we have only done one bonding bill. So therefore, we are not saving the taxpayers any money by not having bonding bills. Instead, these projects are getting more expensive, more costly, and at times, if they are not funded through bonding dollars through the state, those projects end up on the taxpayer through increased higher property taxes, and that affects the family budget. We have at least $6 billion on outstanding requests, and we keep falling behind in this state. So it's going to take all of us working together in this room so that we can get a responsible bonding bill across the finish line. Minnesotans should not be drinking bottled water. They should have access to clean, safe drinking water, and I think that is the goal of this committee, and so look forward to working and partnering with all of you in this room and those watching online as well. So with that, members, I don't think there is anything else to add. Does anybody else have anything to add? No? And then meeting for next week? Yeah. So members, stay tuned to your email and the House calendar, because we will be having a committee hearing next week. And with that, meeting is adjourned.